second session today on the National Glossy Black-Cockatoo Forum. So in this session, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Guy Castley. I'm at Griffith University on the Gold Coast in Australia, and I've been working with the Glossy Black Conservancy and on Glossy Black-Cockatoo research since about 2006. And I'm on the scientific research committee with the Glossy Black Conservancy as well. So that's kind of my background in terms of where I fit in. And Sam, of course, has roped me into facilitating a couple of the sessions today. So the session that we have this morning is to look at one of the key aspects of our Glossy Black-Cockatoos around their feeding habitats and their feeding behaviors and things. And we've got a fantastic bunch of speakers lined up for you. Just a reminder that if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat, and we will have we'll be able to go through those at the end of the session where all the speakers can respond to those particular questions. If we don't get to all the questions, we'll be able to have the speakers respond to them online and download. We can download those responses later on. If you want to change your name, you can just make that change in your profile online. If you have any questions when you do ask those online, if you can just make sure people know who you are. And then I will also just say that I'm joining today from Kombumerri country on the Gold Coast. So I just want to pay my respects to our traditional owners of the country on which I'm sitting on today. I'm sure you're all in different places. So with that, what I'll do is I'll get straight into our first speaker, and we're lucky enough to have Dominique Homberger from Louisiana State University in the United States. Now, Dominique's had a long history with Glossy Black-Cockatoos. I read from her bio, so she's been doing work on glossies here in Australia since the late 1980s, looking at various aspects of their feeding. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dominique to share her insights with us. Thanks very much, Dominique.
Thank you very much, Guy, for your introduction, and thank you very much for including me in your very important conference. And I would like to start by first thanking all my friends, citizen scientists, colleagues, and who showed me where glossies are so that I could observe them, because you all know they are not very common, and I needed for my research, I needed not only to find glossies, but also glossies that are feeding. And for that, I needed the help of local scientists and citizen scientists. So we all know that glossies are very special cockatoos. And I thought that I might introduce how special they are by comparing them first with Now, how does it work here? Okay, by comparing them first to so-called regular or white cockatoos. And I'm especially, of course, interested in the beak, because this is the most important feeding mechanism. And in general, we have these 350 species of parrots worldwide. And the parrot beak is really the quintessential Swiss Army knife. With that parrot beak, we can do all kinds of things. And I have studied the feeding behavior of white cockatoos. This would be the pink cockatoos, the cockatiels, the palm cockatoo, the galah. These I call white cockatoos. And they have a very specific beak that is very similar to the beak of all parrots. There is an overhanging upper bill tip with a tiny, you see it here, transverse step in the front. This is a picture where we can see the mandible. It's a narrow cutting edge of the mandible. And when we look on the underside of the upper bill tip, we see that the surface is corrugated with transverse ridges. And there is here these transverse steps that is quite important. And along the edges, and here we see little white dots, and here larger dots. And these are the ends of papillae that are stuffed with touch receptors. And so we know that the beaks of parrots are very sensitive to touch. So how is this beak used? And there is this kind of stereotypical seed shelling mechanism of parrots because they are seed predators feeding on immature seeds. And one of the things is that these seeds are protected by very toxic seed coats. And so parrots do not only need to remove seed shells, but also the seed coats. And they do this with a very stereotypical feeding mechanism by putting the seed against the rough inside of the upper bill tip and putting it into the corner where there is a step. And then with the tongue, the seed is turned around and placed within the beak in order to remove the seed shell and the seed coat. And here on the left, we see a sulfur-crested cockatoo that is just in taking a red seed with the tongue and dropping the seed shell. So this feeding mechanism is absolutely perfect for eating dicot fruits. And dicot fruits are known to have a fleshy, surrounding of the seed, and then also a very hard, almost stony surrounding, and the seed is protected in. But these seeds have, of course, to sprout when they come down, and therefore they have here a micropyle through which the seedling can come out. And parrots on the left side, this is a fruit that I opened myself manually, and on the right side is a fruit that is opened by a crimson rosella, a typical parrot, and they first remove the fleshy shell and then turn around these seeds in their mouth and find out exactly where the micropyle is, that is on the same level as a seam to hold the two halves of the shell together, and then they apply the force with the lower beak exactly to that weak point. This is very elegant. All parrots do the same thing, and their touch receptors are very important in that. But when I came to Australia in 87, 88 for the first time, I had to learn everything new because Australia is very different, wonderfully different. And I saw that there are all kinds of native Australian plants that do not have this kind of fruit, but have lots of cones, woody cones. And these woody cones cannot be cut across like the other fruits because the seed locules or seed chambers are arranged diagonally. And so I immediately wondered, how are parrots feeding on these cones? And I noticed that when we look at so-called white cockatoos, when they feed, their upper beak is nicely aligned to the lower mandible. But this is not the case with black cockatoos. And the gang is a black cockatoo, and of course all the others are black cockatoos. When we look at them, how they feed, is that actually they move their lower mandible or their mandible sideways. And this is a very important part of the feeding. And I have also worked on the Victorian red-tailed black cockatoo, but today, and on the gang, but today I'm talking only about the glossy. And it's quite clear that the glossy black cockatoo has a beak that is totally different. The upper beak is very short and doesn't overhang the mandible. It has a very sharp right corner of the mandible. When we look in the front, the mandible is wide and curved with two corners, mandibular corners, and they are not symmetrical. And the upper beak is very narrow, very sharp, and very short. And here we see a beak that is closed, and you see that the corner on the left side is not the same as the corner on the right side. And the beak is opposed to the lower mandible. It's a completely different type of beak. Just to recapitulate, to compare directly a white cockatoo beak with a glossy beak and also in the front. And what I would like you to remember is the very sharp, narrow upper bill tip, the wide mandible with the asymmetrical corners, and they are very sharp. And so here I have, because I want to know how this beak is being used, I'm showing you here, a video, and I'm telling you first what you need to look for, because things are very fast. And in this video, you see, I would like you to pay especially attention to the foot, because it's like an acrobatic foot. And also that at a certain point, the foot is let go of the cone, while the cone is kept in the beak. And this maneuver is to rotate the cone, and we will see later why this is important. So you see how things are flying off the beak, and something is happening, but we don't really know exactly what is happening. And I always like to see how and now what we are going to see is slow motion, 4 times slowed. And so watch the foot. You see, it opens the foot while the beak is holding it. And it's very important that the foot can let go so that the cone can rotate. And why that is important, we will see later. But now what you will also see is that we need to have a very clear coordination between the foot motion and the beak motion. And so here I would like to show you, it takes about 2 seconds, how a glossy is extracting a seed from a cone and shelling a seed. So these are 2 very different movements. I'll show you first the whole thing in natural speed, and so you see something is happening, but how this is all going, it's not very clear. And I think this one I can't see. Oh yeah, this is now the slow motion of extracting seeds from the cone. And it's on a loop, so that you will be able to see it again and again. And you see that upper beak is moving. And this is in contrast to white cockatoos that are moving the lower beak. So you see the upper beak is moving. And this was one thing that I noticed right away. And now let me see. Yeah, this is now the seed shelling. And for one seed, it takes about 1 second. This is slow motion. And you see that the right corner of the mandible is working against the inside of the upper bill tip. And the tongue is then holding the seed and taking the seed away when it is shelled. So each seed is being extracted from the cone 1 by 1, and each seed is shelled 1 by 1. The whole procedure is about 2 seconds, so you can imagine this is going very fast. This is a picture that shows at the end of the glossy, and very often you see this kind of hanging braid of something, and these are the seed shells that are sticky inside, and then very often, depending on the maturation stage of the seeds, is sticking to the corner of the mandible and looks like a little beard. So now that we know about the beak morphology and how the beak is used, we want to understand why the glossy black cockatoo is feeding in such a different way, what it is doing and why it has to be so stereotyped. When we look here on the left,
Yes, left, Dominique.
Yes, do you see my pointer? Yeah, is that okay?
Yes.
So on the top left, you see an intact cone with the seed locules or seed chambers arranged diagonally. And we see also here that each seed chamber has two seed walls or locule walls that come together. When we look at the bottom of a cone, we see that these locules are arranged radially. And the surface, and you all know that, the surface is so hard that actually no parrot can go through that. So in order to go into the cone and be able to extract the seed, you have to go into the softer internal wood, and the glossy black-cockatoo does this by pulling off the stalk and has therefore an entrance to the soft wood. And then one by one, and you see here the emptied locule, the locule walls and the seed have to be taken away. This is a movement of the upper beak going into this very soft center and then ripping through the wall and taking out the seed locule. This is a piece of the locule wall when it is all emptied. And this is when the glossy black-cockatoo cuts off a piece of the wall, throws it away, so that the next layer, this would be this, the next layer of seed chambers is exposed. And here we see what happens when the seed chambers are ripped out with the upper beak. They are held together by soft wood. This is the outside, this is the inside, and inside the seed chamber that is closed, you would find the seeds. Now, I was very fortunate, thanks to Brian Hawkins, who gave me some good hint. I was able this time to look at Allocasuarina torullosa, the forest casuarina, and we see that on the outside, we don't see the seed chambers at all. But this is not necessary because the glossies simply start to open the locules. We see here how they take it the same way as in another cone. And we see this here also. It has been, the locules have been taken away. And here are some seeds. And interestingly enough, the seeds are a little bit smaller than in Littoralis. So we feel that, and we hear it all the time, that glossy black-cockatoos are extreme food specialists. Now, as a biologist, I never quite believed in that because it's very dangerous to be a food specialist, because if something happens to this single food source, then there is no food. And while working at the Australian Museum to take measurements and so on, I chanced upon a specimen that showed here the beak caked with something.
2 minutes, Dominique.
Yes?
2 minutes.
Everything? Okay. And so the question is really, is the glossy black-cockatoo really an extreme food specialist? And we need to do more research on that. What can we learn? Fledglings cannot learn from the parents how to process cones. They need to figure it out and practice this by themselves. Takes about a year. This is why the fledglings stay with the parents. Because of the time-consuming feeding mechanism, the glossies have to be very selective which trees they are feeding from. Because the feeding trees are scattered, glossies need to have excellent memories, sometimes 50 kilometers apart, and we saw that after 2020, that suddenly glossies appeared in places that had never been seen before. And they need to have water, and the nesting holes need to be near water and feeding trees. So here I allow myself to make some recommendations or raise questions based on my experience. namely mapping feeding trees according to their soil. And I'm glad that Gail Crowley will be here. I'm very excited. We need to reevaluate prescribed burning because Alocasuarina species are not fire resistant. I have seen this in the Pelagas, doesn't look good. Stopping old growth casuarinas protect more wilderness. I think this is non-controversial. But one thing that I have been trying to tell again and again is that we need to, in Australia, to beware of the very hot wildlife trade. And here is this a famous case, and namely with glossy black-cockatoos. And the Guardian has made research on that and found that about 100 to 200 glossy black-cockatoos were bought by this guy who is not respected in Europe. And he got a permission to export these hundreds of glossy black-cockatoos. And nobody understood why that is possible. And you see that there is still, how to say, an investigation. And I think your group probably should ask the government what has happened with that. And this is why I recommend very strongly, and I know that some of my colleagues do the same, that nesting trees need to be remain secret, because poachers go to nests and get the nestlings out. You can't catch adults, but you can catch the nestlings. And with that, I would like to thank the many, many citizen scientists and friends who allowed me to see where they saw glossies to feed, and especially here my husband, who is responsible for the logistics for us to find the glossies and do all the observations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Dominique. We have a little bit of time for questions, and we've got one from Danny Teixeira in the chat line already. Did you want to ask it, Danny, or do you want me to just ask it? I might just do it. So Danny was asking whether we think it's feasible to identify or confidently identify glossy black-cockatoo chewings from the way that they working through the cones from other parrot chewings?
Oh, it's completely different. I mean, glossy chewings are totally identifiable as glossy chewings. No other parrot can eat cones, closed cones. Only glossies can do it because the beaks of other parrots are structured differently. And I have looked at all except one subspecies of red-tailed black-cockatoos, and their beaks are very different.
Because we've certainly seen galah, for example, that feed on some of the coastal sheoaks and some of the littoralis, for example, but they don't process the cone as well as the glossies do.
No.
Yeah. There's another question from Brian Hawkins in the chat. Curious about the relationship between glossies and sheoaks. Thinking of glossies as seed predators, do they play a role in dispersing any of the seeds?
No.
Do you know, Dominique?
Parrots in general are seed predators, all of them. That's their specialization. And seed predators destroy seeds. So they are not really very good at dispersing, except maybe the yellow-tailed black-cockatoos that carry around pine cones. And this is what actually we don't like them to do, but they do this. And they disperse pine seeds, unfortunately.
All right, we may have to wrap it up there with question time. If you wanted to have a look in the chat, Dominique, there are a couple of other questions coming in that you might be able to respond to in the chat. But just so we can keep on time, I think we'll move on to our next presenter, who is Janet Carew. So Janet is one of our local presenters from the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. And Janet's also got a long history with glossy black-cockatoo, but a range of other kind of things that she's done in her life, things like that. But I think at heart, she's a conservationist and really passionate about glossy black cockatoos. And she's going to be telling us a bit about her experiences with their foraging behaviors on Casuarina torolosa. So Janet, I'll hand over to you if you want to share your screen.
Yes, hi, thanks Guy, and hello everyone. It's so exciting so far. So this might link in with some of the other speakers, hopefully. So today my subject is Glossy Black-Cockatoo southeastern feeding habits, focusing on Casuarina torolosa as their chosen food source. As we know, they're listed as vulnerable to extinction now in state and federal legislation. And you also will know about the effects of negative effects of changing climate, habitat destruction and fragmentation, their specific requirements for nest sites and breeding, and their highly selective fussy feeding habits. And I've added an extra one relating to the limitations of their chosen food source in the wild, Casuarina raceyi species. I'll speak today about my journey since purchasing my 36-acre property in the hinterland of the Sunshine Coast in 2002. Since then, I've carried out habitat protection and restoration alone and with Land for Wildlife, contractors and volunteers, set up a conservation covenant and negotiated a voluntary conservation agreement with Sunshine Coast Council. Noticing changes in the habitat of Casuarina torolosa, which is the only Casuarina species on the property, I was concerned at the effects of climate change, time since fire, neighbouring developments, and encroaching rainforest species that tend to shade out Casuarinas over time, and wondered, how do I ensure an ongoing food source for glossies? How do I get more feed trees, and why focus on the food source at all? Some logical answers are that glossies need to feed every day to survive, but they rely on vulnerable food sources that are diminishing. While I knew that more research was needed to answer the questions, I decided to take action now and establish the Future Food for Glossies project in 2019. I also contacted Dr. Gabriel Conroy at University of Sunshine Coast to ask for a student to come and do the research. But as no one was available, I set out to undertake an honours research project myself with him later that year. I'll start with a bit more about their feeding specialisation. Studies have shown that they select only 2 to 3 she-oak subspecies present in their foraging area, and select less than 25% of available cone-bearing trees, seeking the highest quantum and nutritional return on feeding investment. In southeast Queensland, the main food sources are Casuarina littoralis and Casuarina torolosa, with infrequent feeding on the coastal Casuarina aquisitifolia. Casuarinas are dioecious, that is, separate male and female plants, so require synchronous inflorescence for pollination to occur. And torolosa cones take more than 18 months to mature after pollination. This is the private conservation research site at Mooloolah. I named it Torolosa Terraces. It is mainly dry sclerophyll with remnant rainforest in the gullies. Dalarcha National Park lies to the south of the map, with private Land for Wildlife properties in the vicinity, and a significant gubby-gubby reserve in Diamond Valley to the northwest of the map. My first action was to establish the Future Food for Glossies project, as I said, in 2019, supported by Barung Landcare with seed collection, use of their commercial nursery for germination and propagation, and eventual sale, and later Ben Green from Sunshine Coast Council with allocation of 2 council reserve land and contractors for planting in 2020 due to COVID restrictions. Southeast Land Repair and Hinterland Bushlinks volunteers for planting also in 2020, just before the first lockdown. at Taurulosa terraces. My aims were to contribute to the conservation of glossy black cockatoos by establishing what proportion of the test Taurulosa trees eventually become feed trees, and to promote the importance of planting more potential feed trees across the Sunshine Coast and beyond. And to do this by collecting cones from known Taurulosa feed trees at Taurulosa terraces for propagation and planting at 3 test research sites, by monitoring their growth, development, and evidence of feeding for 10 years to establish the percentage of feed trees at each site and provide resulting data for future research. At a broader scale, by collecting and promoting the collection of seed from known feed trees of Taurulosa and other Casuarina species at other sites for revegetation elsewhere, and to promote this to council, barung, other land care groups and conservationists. The results so far to September 24 of this Future Food for Glossies project. All 450 test trees propagated from seed of feed trees at Taurulosa terraces and planted in March 2020 are numbered and able to be traced back to the parent feed tree. The first site, Type 2 Unreserve, of 46% of 350 trees planted, the height varies between 1 and 6 meters, and 27% of those with cones. So they're only 4 years old, and a small proportion so far have got to that height. Whereas at Taurulosa terraces in the A site, the trees are a lot smaller and the sex is indeterminate at that stage of growth. Second site, 50 trees not accessible due to landslips during weather events. Okay, so I've also established informal arrangements with Barung Land Care and Sunshine Coast Council, who continue to support the project. I continue to provide seed from known feed trees, Taurulosa and Littoralis, collected in the area, to Barung for germination, sale and planting. And so over 5,000 trees have been propagated by Barung and planted by council organisations and landholders to this year. I have over 600 followers on social media. The second part of my action was to undertake the research project with the Sunshine Coast University with the Honours Project, where we aim to determine how feed and non-feed trees are distributed in the landscape and utilised for feeding over time, if there is significant chronological variation in the magnitude of feeding. This was a baseline study on a small site. So we were able to cite the whole map using drone technology, followed by ground GPS coordinates of each female Taurulosa tree. Each tree was monitored monthly for evidence of feeding activity and magnitude of feeding over 12 consecutive months in 2021. Results from the drone, ground GPS coordinates and feeding activity per tree were uploaded to Metashape and analysed with algorithms and cluster analysis with HDB scan to produce an orthomosaic map of feed trees for further analysis. Some feeding occurred each month of 2021. You can see evidence sometimes in months not much. Glossies fed at the highest percentage of feed trees from July to September. Obviously, this suggests other feeding habitats being utilised elsewhere. Where are they? It'd be good to know where they are. Magnitude of feeding was measured by the number of orts each month. There was no statistical difference in feeding magnitude over time, given the small sample, but 68% of total feeding magnitude occurred in July, August, and September. And approximately 85% of total feeding magnitude occurred in cluster 2, which is represented in red, and the highest food value trees, given by the number of orts, all in cluster 2. So what can we say about the distribution and the implications of the distribution of female Taurulosa trees and feed trees? The results shown on the populated orthomosaic map after cluster analysis shows that there are 5 density-based clusters. And the calculations applied show that 61% of female trees on the site were feed trees. This result far exceeds findings in other studies of Casuarinas elsewhere, with 16 to 24% feed trees in the study sites. 3 of the clusters contained 46 to 78% feed trees.
5 minutes, Janet.
Thank you. It's interesting to note that 70% of the site's feed trees were also in cluster 2, while cluster 1 had no feed trees at all. This may indicate that offspring may have similar characteristics as the parent trees. More research is needed here. For now, it can be concluded that the site is a high-value feeding habitat. This study also showed that the largest and most abundant female cone-producing Taurulosa trees were on north and northeast facing slopes and edges with access to full sunshine, whereas few Taurulosa were on south or southwest facing slopes with mostly shade and little sun, and none of those were feed trees. Does this indicate the importance of open forests and sunshine for successful cone development of Casuarina taurulosa, among other reasons? Data collected during 21 showed that new feed trees were utilised later in the year of study and not earlier. That is, the first time they were ever recorded as feed trees. Consider this for the implications of this for shorter studies. In addition, no glossies were sighted at the site again until 2022 in August, with the first evidence of feeding found in March 24. Few large cones are available and few have reached maturity to date, so I estimate that we won't get another crop ready for full-time feeding until 2025. The lack of production of cones between heavy feeding in 21 and 24, with high winds and large rain events in 2023, may indicate that synchronous inflorescence did not occur successfully soon after trees were stripped. In summary, the high proportion of feed trees at the site in total and within some clusters far exceeds results from other studies on other feed tree subspecies in various locations and suggests this is a high-value feeding habitat. The clustering of feed trees and feed tree percentages indicates the possibility that offspring may have the same characteristics as parent trees regarding feed tree potential, and may indicate that the Future Food for Glossy's project is on the right track in this regard. Peak feeding magnitude and tree utilisation from July to September suggest alternative feeding habitats available in the area. Once again, where are they? So ideas following on from Dominique's as well, which are fantastic, for future research: identify other high-value feeding habitat sites for study, identify foraging site characteristics relative to the percentage of high-value feed trees, investigate the potential of high-value feed trees producing similar high-value offspring. To improve feeding habitat, recommend habitat management plans include strategies for the special needs of Casuarina and Casuarina, and the collection of seed from high-value feed trees for use in foraging. They've become more important to learn about their conservation, and findings from this study may be useful in some recovery strategies. I'd like to thank you all, particularly the Conservancy, for the opportunity to speak in this forum, and to all those who assisted me in my research with the university and also the work with Future Food for Glossy's project. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Janet. That's great talk.
Thank you.
There's time for probably one or two quick questions before we move over to the next talk. There's one from Brian in the chat, wanting to know whether the increase in feeding from July onwards might be related to when the cones were ripening or the availability. So in other words, was the cone density on the trees higher around that time, and were they getting more mature that the glossies were feeding them more?
Yes, short answer, yes. I was monitoring, even though that wasn't part of the formal study within the restrictions of the honours project, because I've worked out too that they can take, say, 18 months to 2 years to actually reach maturity. So I was noticing when I was identifying female trees, if they didn't have too many cones on at the first time I recorded them as female trees, they became feed trees later in the year as those cones came to maturity.
Yep.
And unofficially, I also, being resident on the property, was able to record the number of trees that birds that came into the trees near the dam for roosting and for watering. And they increased significantly through that time as well. That doesn't mean they're all feeding on that site, though.
Yep. Okay, there's quite a few questions coming up in the chat. We might have you have a look at those online, Janet. And
I just saw that one about determining the sex at seedling stage, and that's something that would be really useful. I have nothing determined at this stage, but I did start noticing coloration in the cladodes when the trees were quite small, but there's no definitive way that I've found so far at the seedling stage.
Awesome. Thanks, Janet. We'll move over to our next talk and try and get to some of those other questions later on in the session after all the presenters have wrapped up. Presenter, so Gabriel Crowley is also a long-standing researcher on glossy black-cockatoos, and some of her recent work, I think, is the focus of her talk here, looking at the relationship between glossy feeding habitat and soil. So take it away, Gabe.
So some of the work that I'm going to talk about here, I've done on Kangaroo Island, and I started working on the glossies back in 98 when, 96, when I came across to live on the island for 2 years and work on the glossies. And some of you will be aware of my feeding habitat work and foraging work. The work that I'm presenting today extends that into soils and geologies. So I'll be talking about some of the same samples that I used in the first publications will have been carried on for this study. But this talk aims to make people think about the environment in which glossies are most likely to be found. And that's something that's been raised by the previous speakers. As we've heard, they're very fussy birds, and they usually only feed on 1 or 2 species of sheart wherever they occur. And because they're such specialists, and they spend quite a lot of time feeding, they need to be able to distinguish between good trees and mediocre trees. I'll present a few statistics here. I won't talk about all of them because some of them have been mentioned already, but the main one that I'll be talking about here is food value. And food value differs from Clout's index in that it actually is the amount of kernel matter that comes out of a cone rather than the amount of seed matter. And that's really important because I've actually opened cones where there's no kernel matter in any of the seeds at all. So you can get, Clout's index is a very good index, but it's not as accurate as food value. So from some of the work that we did earlier, we found that the glossies fed on about 10,000 kernels a day, and the males eat more than females. Breeding birds, breeding males eat more than non-breeding males, because they have to feed the female, and then the female, when she's feeding, has to feed the chick as well. So to get the amount of feed that they need to open about 100 cones a day. Their intake is about 5% of their body weight. And a budgie, for comparison, eats about 20% of its body weight. So this just goes to show that sheoak kernels are really a real superfood. They're about 50% protein. They spend about 1/4 of daylight hours feeding. So we used to think they fed all day, but when Tamara Chapman was doing her PhD, she monitored feeding of birds that she could track from first thing in the morning to last thing at night. And she found that it was about 1/4 of the day, and it's about 36% when they're feeding. So they spend most of the rest of the day resting, and I suspect that that's actually quite a lot of work doing that, because these kernels might be quite, take a big metabolic load to digest them. So they're not doing nothing. And as Dominique said, they make such an investment in feeding on sheoaks that they need to be able to select trees that will be most profitable for them. And this comes down to soil and ultimately geology. And Janet, it'd be very interesting to see what the different soil types are across your property, because I suspect that the soil and the geology has a role there as well as elsewhere. Now, I apologise to the people who are not scientifically trained. I've got a few models here that I'll explain as simply as I can to work out where the good trees for the glossies grow. I took soil samples of 84 drooping sheoak on Kangaroo Island, the SA mainland, and from the Riverina. And this is the areas that they're known to feed predominantly or exclusively on drooping sheoak. And this chart here, you can think of as kind of a map of the soil samples. And what I did was, for the soil samples, I analysed 15 different soil variables, all the normal ones: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, cations, pH, and ran it through a principal components analysis. And what a principal components analysis does is it groups together soils that are similar and teases apart ones that are different. So using all those measures, I found that the soils under sheoaks were discriminated by how acid the soils were and how saline they were. And as you can see, the vertical axis is labelled acidity. That's the acidity score, which is derived from the analysis. And the horizontal axis is salinity. And again, that's derived from a number of different nutrients that contributed to salinity. Now, on this graph, you can see the 84 soil samples. And you can see that aluminium contributes most of the weight to the vertical axis, and as do 2 different measures of pH. I haven't put on the chart all the vectors that relate to the other nutrients, because they actually didn't really discriminate between the soil samples at all. And the analysis didn't measure at all, it didn't take into account whether the trees were feeding trees or the food value. These measures I've added later. So you can see that the feeding trees, the black ones, are all clustered in an area which is positive acidity, high acidity scores, and fairly neutral salinity scores. And it's a fairly small area. And then overlapping with that are the non-feeding trees, and then this large red ellipse is from all the trees from areas where no glossies have been recorded in the last 20 years. And this blue arrow here is where I've plotted on how food value relates to the soil. So again, high food value in soils with neutral salinity and high acidity scores. Now, when it comes to what sort of rock type these soils are on, you can see most of the soils were on sedimentary rocks, and that sands and alluvium tended to have poor acidity scores. And the other thing here is that the ellipse with the feeding trees really had no soils with high exchangeable calcium. I then ran an analysis called a random forest analysis. And what random forest modeling does is that it takes all the variables that you have measured for your trees and shuffles them up, and each time does a new model and to work out what causes high food value. And then it does that 1,000 or more times, and then it picks out the variables that came up most often. And the one that came up absolutely highest was rock type. After that was the acidity score from the principal components analysis, and after that was exchangeable calcium. So you can see that laterite and sedimentary rocks had the highest effect on food value, and that as acidity got above a 0 value, the food value jumped up, and once the exchangeable calcium got above 17 milliequivalents per 100 grams, that the food value dropped off. So how that applies to the drooping sheer oak habitat, which is mostly on Kangaroo Island. And this has really, these ideas have really formulated influence where we've had revegetation done on Kangaroo Island for the last 2 decades, basically replanting she oaks in areas that would have been good she oak habitat in the first place. But can we apply these findings to other places? To find out, I went to the New South Wales Bionet Atlas and extracted out the feeding records and compared them to the she oaks. And this time I found, I concentrated on black she oak and forest she oaks. So they're the Littoralis and Toyolosa that have been referred to at Danny's and Janet's talk and Dominique's talk. And you can see here, this is a map of all the records of black she oak. That's 12,000 trees and 171 feeding records, which you can see are quite confined to a small area. And there's large areas that just seem to not be used at all. And if we then look at the favoured rock type, which is non-calcareous sedimentary rock, so we drop out the other rock types, and you can see that that's the feeding records are on the favoured rock type that we identified from drooping she oak. And the highest ratio between feeding and non-feeding trees in black she oak was in the Brooklana beds up inland from Coffs Harbour. Then for forest oak, we have a similar situation. This time, 11,454 trees and 1,000 feeding records. And again, you can see that feeding records are aligned to the favoured rock type. So once you drop out that other rock type that isn't sedimentary rock, you're left with the areas where you're most likely to get glossy feeding records. In this case, again, the Brooklana beds had the highest ratio between, if we had more feeding records than non-feeding records up there. All the high feeding ratios were on sedimentary rocks with almost either no or almost no limestone or calcarenite elements, and they're all between Newcastle and Grafton. I did have a spatial element in the models, so it said that there really wasn't any effect from north to south. It was the rock type that was the dominant factor. So this interestingly shows that the probability of feeding trees being recorded in any 1 hectare cell that contained either black she oak or forest oak. And despite what looked like from Danny's work that littoralis might have higher food value, forest oaks are preferred over the black she oak, and the trees on non-calcareous sedimentary rocks are preferred over trees on other rock types. So the implications of this is that we need to look to the soils and the parent materials if we're going to successfully conserve glossies. Conserving large patches of she oaks without knowing where the good trees are and where the productive soils are can be a waste of time. But focusing our efforts on the highly productive geological units, we can maximise the number of glossies that can be supported. And this work provides guidance on where those sites are.
Great, fantastic. Thanks very much, Gay. Yeah, really useful implications there in terms of how we go forward with conserving cockatoo landscapes. There was one question from Spencer in the chat about the Brookline beds. Is that in the proposed Great Koala National Park? I'm not sure where that proposal's gone in.
I'm afraid I don't know New South Wales that well. Really, I've done this from a data dump alone, but that would certainly be worth looking into.
Yeah. But I think it's useful implications there in terms of how we can direct conservation efforts and land conservation activities and stuff around the place. So yeah, we might leave some questions until later on in the session if we have some time, but we've already gone a bit over time with some of the technical issues. So hopefully, Trish, you guys are ready to go now. So I'll hand back to you, and you can share your views and insights from Kangaroo Island.
I'm not sure how that. I think we'll just stick with this.
Okay, go for it.
All right.
It just means that the screen, any sort of animations will be a little bit tricky. But basically, I'd like to first acknowledge the Ngarrindjeri, Ramangeri and Kaurna peoples for whom Kangaroo Island is traditional lands. This is a slide that shows you where Kangaroo Island is in relation to southeast Queensland. It's a large island off the South Australian coast, about 15 kilometres off the South Australian coast. And I'm assuming you are seeing these different slides as I work through.
We are, yep.
My research aim was to investigate the impacts of the Black Summer bushfires on Kangaroo Island foraging and breeding behaviour. That's my sort of, for my whole PhD. Previous studies have looked at foraging ecology and feeding habitat quality, but the fires provide an opportunity to look at how they've responded to a significant but temporary loss of habitat. This is just a quick context slide showing there's been a 30-year recovery program for glossies on Kangaroo Island, involving actions such as protection of nest trees from possums and nest hollows from invasion of honeybees, targeted habitat restoration, and so on. And so through an awful lot of effort over a long period of time involving lots of different people, and this graph is from the recovery program by Carlia, who'll be talking in the next session. You can see that the glossies had recovered from, the population had recovered from around 200 birds in the early 1990s to 373 before the fires. And since the fires, the population appears to be stabilising according to Carlia's latest census results at around 420 to 450 birds. Glossies have a highly specialised diet. On Kangaroo Island, they feed exclusively pretty much on drooping sheoak Allocagerina verticillata. As previously noted, the trees are, like most sheoaks, they're dioecious. So here you can see the male trees in pollen, the golden coloured trees. And glossies also, glossies feed on the female trees that have the cones. And drooping sheoak habitat is around 2 to 3% of the remnant vegetation on Kangaroo Island. Glossies feed on the russet cones that have been produced in the previous 8 months rather than the older grey cones. These cones generally occur towards the ends of sheoak branches, and you can see in these pictures here, they were actually taken last year at about this time of the year. You can see large immature cones, but also smaller immature cones, a younger cohort that's also coming on. Tamara Chapman, in her extensive PhD work in the 90s, found that flowering of female trees and also of male trees occurs throughout a lot of the year, but there's a peak in winter, resulting in good availability of suitable mature russet cones at the start of the Glossy Black-Cockatoo breeding season in late January. So foraging glossies on Kangaroo Island leave a carpet of chewed fragments and cone ends that we know as chewings. These were initially a creamy green colour, but they pretty rapidly weather to the bright orange in this photo, and then over a period of time to pale orange and then pale brown. In his PhD work in the early 90s, John Pepper found that, that at the 43 localities that he located with feeding sign, there was a mean 16% of the feeding trees, female trees, sorry, that were foraged but there was quite a wide variation from very little up to about 30.5%. He also found that the best predictors of foraging intensity were seed mass per cone and the ratio of seed to cone mass, not quite Clout's index. Studies on KI have confirmed that glossies show a marked preference for individual trees, and Gay's already referred to Clout's index. But John Pepper also found that site was also quite a good predictor of foraging. A quick background on the fires on Kangaroo Island. So in late 2019, early 2020, the fires developed very rapidly, and 38% of the island burnt in a single day, which was something most of us never thought possible. On a southwesterly wind change. Subsequently, over the next few weeks, around half of the island's area was burnt. And this resulted in, so in the photo on the left, the red is the extent of the fires and the yellow is feeding habitat. This resulted, the recovery program, just doing it without notes, the recovery program did some fairly extensive surveys in the few months after the fires, funded actually through World Wildlife Fund, and found that, you know, lots of the flop regions that glossies are sort of distributed loosely in across the island had more than 50% of their habitat burnt, with some having 70 to 90% of habitat burnt. So these photos were taken 2 years after the fires and show dense seedling regeneration in Pardana Conservation Park. We sort of know from observations over the years that it's likely to be 10 to 15 years before the sheoak develops sufficient cone crops to be useful as a food source for glossies. So it's a temporary loss of feeding habitat, but it's going to go on for a few years yet. Other observations after the fires were that glossies appear to be feeding on a higher proportion, perhaps 50 to 60% of female sheoaks than had been recorded in those earlier studies in the 1990s. And there was extensive use of revegetation areas as well as remnant habitat. So I basically had three hypotheses: that foraging intensity is significantly higher in flock regions impacted by the fires. It's higher in revegetation areas because we know from other work that they've got higher food value than some of the remnant habitat, and that glossies are feeding on cones with lower food profitability in the fire impacted flock regions because they're having to feed on a higher percentage of the trees. So basically I did foraging intensity surveys over 3 time periods during the 2023 breeding season, post-breeding in the same year, and then this year in the breeding season. And you can see there some of the breakdown of around those surveys. There were 24 in 2023, 26 post-breeding 2023, and 39 during the breeding season this year, with a mixture of burnt versus unburnt and remnant versus re-veg. And to analyse the association of foraging intensity with a number of variables, including fire impact and vegetation type and re-veg age, I used a beta binomial generalised linear mix model, accounting for over-dispersion and with location as a random effect. So here are some of the results. Just looking at the top row of box plots first, you can see that there's a significant difference in foraging intensity between the burnt flock regions, greater than 50% burnt flock regions, and the less than 50% burnt. And that relationship is evident in all 3 survey periods. The other thing I just draw your attention to is the actual numbers on the y-axis. And you can see that the median foraging intensity in the less than 50% burnt, so the left-hand plots in each of those top graphs, are around 20 to 30%, which, so even in the areas not affected by fire, the foraging intensity is higher than in those earlier surveys by John Pepper, which had a mean of about 16%, a range up to 30%. These have a higher range. And the 3 green shaded box plots along the bottom show that there's no significant relationship between foraging intensity and whether it's remnant or revegetation. Remnant habitat or revegetation, although during the 2023 post-breeding period, there's certainly a bit of a relationship there. Hang on, I've just got something that's popped up here. I did a bit further exploration of the exploration of the 2024 data, and found that there was an indicator of lower foraging intensity in the older revegetation, the 16 to 35 year revegetation. So I did include that in the model, but the bottom right-hand graph is showing that there's no clear relationship between foraging intensity and the Klaus index of the feeding trees, and that wasn't significant. Just exploring some of this a bit further, you can see that accounting for fire impact, so the left-hand part of this facet wrap graph is less than 50% burnt trees, and the right-hand side is greater than 50% burnt trees in those greater than 50% burnt sites. Accounting for fire impact, foraging intensity is lower in the older revegetation. So this is the actual model. There is a significant difference in foraging intensity by fire impact, and age category also has an influence. And these are some preliminary results from Klaus Index of feeding trees. And I just want to emphasize that I only sampled the trees the birds were actually feeding on. So all this data is from actual feeding trees. And basically what I found here is that they're looking at the top graphs again, and actually here I've just got the breeding season results. So for 2023 and 2024, there is no significant difference in Clout's index between the trees that they're feeding on in the less than 50% burnt flock regions and the greater than 50% burnt flock regions, and that also applies to differences between remnant vegetation and revegetation. So in conclusion, there are higher mean, or actually it's median foraging intensities across sites than reported by the 1990s studies. There were fewer birds around them, but they are using larger areas of the island now. So maybe, certainly, there's an indication that generally the birds are feeding in, on 20 to 30% of the trees, not lower than that. There is a significant difference in foraging intensity by fire impact, with a higher foraging rate in burnt versus unburnt flock regions. Both re-veg and remnant feeding habitat areas are being used extensively, with higher foraging rates in remnant habitat and younger revegetation. And the preliminary analysis of Clout's index data indicates that the cone profitability of glossy black feeding trees is not significantly different for burnt versus unburnt regions, despite the higher foraging rates observed. So in terms of my hypotheses, yes, foraging intensity is significantly higher in those regions affected by the fires. No, it's not higher in revegetation areas, not according to this study anyway. And glossies are not feeding on cones with lower profitability. So even though, so it does appear that they can, certainly in those western flock regions that were impacted by the fires, they can up their foraging rate, but still be feeding on cones of quite good quality as far as Clout's index indicators go anyway. And that's the talk. So thank you to Prof. Stephen Garnett at CDU, and especially to Miriam Casey, who helped with the analyses, to the volunteers who spent time out with me doing shear monitoring, Philippa, Drew and Sue and Peter, and to the crew from the Glossy Black-Cockatoo Recovery Program here, and also to Gay Crowley, who provided advice in the early stages of the project. Right, so I finally got through that.
That's good.
Fantastic. Thanks, Trish. Yeah, really interesting to see the responses there. So we have, I just want to say thanks to all the speakers. Yeah, thanks very much for the really useful and insightful presentations around what's been going with the glossies and feeding and foraging areas. We've got 10 minutes or so for open question and Q&A time with all the speakers. So if anybody has got any questions that they wanted to ask of any of the speakers, please either just pop it into the chat. I'll have to scroll back up to see some of the ones that may need to be re-asked. Otherwise, maybe just pop your hand up in the... Yeah, so Larissa's asking that on the south coast, some of the littoralis are not dioecious. So there are some trees where there's both male and female inflorescences on the same tree. And whether there's any information or that people have about the food value on those particular trees where there's both sexes on a single tree. It's certainly the case, Larissa. We certainly have a couple of individuals here on the Gold Coast that are also like that, so where there's both male and female on the same tree. But yeah, any Gay, I'm not sure if you have any insights there, or Trish.
I'm not sure what the question is.
If a tree is not dioecious, if you're getting a tree that is monoecious, so littoralis with both male and female inflorescences on the single tree, do we know if cones that develop on those trees have a lower food value than cones on a purely dioecious tree?
Well, if the glossies are feeding on them, they've got a high food value.
Yeah. Yeah,
so if the glossies aren't feeding on them, we don't know. But if the glossies are feeding on them, they won't feed on a tree that has a low feed value. And it's really interesting that Trish's work is showing that they don't compromise on this even when the habitat's been burnt.
Yeah.
Cool. I had a question for Trish. I think someone else just posted a similar question in the chat. Did you notice that if there was lower breeding success for the birds in flock regions where most of the habitat was burnt than in flock regions where most of the habitat wasn't burnt?
And my study didn't actually involve looking at breeding success, but Carlia's right here in the recovery program has looked at that. So I'm going to...
Yeah, just very quickly, we have breeding success has been the same in unburnt and burnt areas on Kangaroo Island since the fires, but what we have noticed is we're recording fewer nests. So our theory at the moment is that fewer pairs are choosing to breed. So they're not attempting and then just failing. They're just not breeding in the first place.
Yeah, so that kind
That's
of
really
leads into
interesting.
the other questions that was in the chat as well from Louise, whether there's been a decrease in breeding success following the increase in foraging intensity on the island. I think so that aligns maybe with what you were saying there, Carlia, where there's been a reduction in the breeding attempts. So they're spending more time just trying to get the food and putting less effort into breeding.
Yeah, that's what we think, because the nests that we monitor, there are fewer pairs at our nest sites nesting, but the nests have exactly the same success as they were having pre-fire and compared with the eastern flocks.
Adrian has a question for Dominique. He's asking whether we see if there's any different feeding styles in glossy blacks, whether we can kind of determine whether the bird might be a biter, driller, or different, so do individual birds have different styles of feeding? So do some drill into the cone and shred, or do some shred more and then drill? Or you're muted, Dominique.
No, I didn't see any differences, but I think it is because the glossies have to work so fast. And so it has to be, there is one best method to do it. And when I observed fledglings, they simply don't make good progress. Things all fall out of their beaks and so on, and they clearly can't get enough food. And then they start to beg, and the parents, have to feed it and so on. And I really think that they have to practice to be so fast, because otherwise they don't get enough food. Now, what I noticed is that there are differences depending on the species, because if you go to the inland places, there are very different casuarina species, and the cones are different. Not only smaller, but they are also constructed differently. Basically the same, but there are different ways on how to feed on the different cones. So this is something that I'm still have to write up. There will be a paper coming out, and that might be quite interesting.
Yeah, there's an interesting kind of tack-on question there about where a single species like a glossy black-cockatoo, for example, feeds on different species throughout its range, whether it needs to adopt a different feeding strategy to, for example, get into a verticillata cone compared to a torullosa cone, compared to a casuarina cristata cone out west, because they spread so far across the landscape, and each of those feed trees differ. So I'm not sure if you have any kind of comment on that, Dominique.
Yeah, I think I have a big question on that. I think it's an extremely important question, because I have seen that the inland glossy black-cockatoos feed differently from the coastal glossy black-cockatoos. Now the problem is, are these different birds, or are the birds flying back and forth? And we have the same problem with many red-tailed black-cockatoos, that we simply do not have the data on how to say, we can't ring cockatoos because they will take off the rings. But we don't know whether these are the same birds that migrate between different places, or whether these are different birds that are staying in different places.
Yeah. There was another question for you, Gay, from Brian Hawkins again. Do you know why glossies might prefer trees on rocks with different chemical characteristics?
I've just typed back that that's where the high food value trees are growing.
Yeah.
So, but I have a question for Dominica. You said that other black cockatoos can't feed on casuarina cones. Obviously, the red-tailed blacks in Victoria are feeding on casuarina
They feed on
casuarina. So
yes, they do.
And I've seen red-tailed blacks in northern Australia feeding on equisetifolia, but only when they're soft.
Yeah.
So are there bill differences that allow the red-tailed blacks to feed on them?
The beaks are very different in the red-tailed black-cockatoos. And you mentioned two things that I wish I could be there, but Casuarina lumani has cones that are not serotinous. So they are available, according to Richard Hill, only in February, March. You probably know better. And this is not when I can come to Australia. I have to, okay. And the same thing, I was in Darwin and talked with Stephen Garnett, and I saw the casuarinas there. And Stephen told me, yes, red-tailed black-cockatoos feed on them, but these are again casuarinas that are not serotinous. And I was there in October, and this is not when the cones are available. So once I have published my thing, or if you want to talk to me, I'm quite happy to work with you, is that I need Australian scientists who are year-round in Australia and are at the right place at the right moment to watch the cockatoos feeding on these special things. One thing that I was able to do, I went to Central Australia, near Alice Springs, and there is a literature that says that the locals red-tailed black-cockatoos feed on these very large, huge cones in
Decasiana.
And I, of course, wanted to see that. And then I realized that the casuarinas are, with these huge cones, are growing in places where the red-tailed black-cockatoos do not go. Okay, so I looked at the cones and I can't see how any bird can get into those cones. But they are living.
Well,
yeah.
I find that fascinating because back in at 1983, I saw what I presumed were red-tailed black-cockatoos feeding on Casuarina tortuosa up at Kirrama behind Cardwell. And we've got no records of glossies up there, so I just assumed they were red-tailed blacks. But what you're saying suggests that they were glossies, and we know they go as far north as Townsville. So maybe, Danny, that's a place where we should be putting some sound acoustic recorders in and getting some ideas about the populations up there.
I know that my friends in Coffs Harbour that had a house in Upper Corindi said that there are red-tailed black-cockatoos coming there to feed. But, you know, I don't know whether these were really red-tails or glossies, and I didn't see them. So there is lots of research that has to be done. And one thing that we need to keep in mind is that the glossies have been recognized as a separate species from the red-tails only relatively recently. So it is quite easy to confuse them. And but I still think that the red-tails do not have the special mandibular shape and narrow upper beak shape to go into the cones. But, you know, if you see something else, I will be delighted. So bring it on.
I'm sure they could get into green cones because they're not so hard.
You see, that's of course the thing that I pointed out, this kind of dirty beak in one specimen. Actually, there are several such specimens at the Australian Museum. And I was wondering whether they eat green cones or something else, because the mature cones leave the beak completely clean because it's just wood.
Right, folks, we might have to wrap it up there.